Try to imagine yourself in a small village in the 1500s in Spain, and on the horizon you see men approaching, and they run to the town saying, "The Inquisition is coming, the Inquisition is coming," and fear begins to take you. The Inquisition. Or actually, a better way to describe it is not so much the Inquisition, but the Inquisitions, plural. Because we'll discover that whenever the Inquisition operates in a different place in Europe, it's going to have different motives, different techniques, different people who are in control of it. It's never one huge monumental thing. It's always addressing specific problems in specific places. And what I'd suggest is maybe the best way to approach this talk is for a moment just try to forget anything you may have heard about the Inquisition. And I don't want this talk to be something where you feel that you have to agree with it, you have to support it. You can leave this talk feeling totally disgusted and frustrated by it, and that's just fine. The point here is very much to try to enter into the mindset of the people when this was taking place, trying to understand their motives, what drove them to this great thing that we know now as the Inquisition. A not very helpful way to approach it is to simply discard it and say, oh, just superstition and intolerance of the past. Well, that doesn't really get us very far. On the other hand, to simply say it was the most wonderful thing that ever happened and it is inexcusable is also not going to get you very far. Somewhere in the middle, we have to understand this whole movement in Europe that we call today the Inquisition. And if you had to sum it up, what was the whole issue? Well, it came down to the question of heresy. Heresy being beliefs that were contrary to Catholic doctrine, to what we believe as Catholics, that deposit of faith handed to us by the Lord Jesus and the apostles, I should say. The whole problem of heresy, I suppose, if you wanted to use a modern comparison, it was like the terrorism of the Middle Ages. It was seen as the enemy that struck within to break the very foundation of what the world was built on, what Christendom, what the kingdom of Jesus Christ was built on. And anytime heresy appeared, there was a great zeal for it to be addressed and to try to stop it before it could spread and cause more confusion and dissension across Christians. This idea of an Inquisition is not something the Christians actually thought up. When Christianity began to grow, it adopted with it the culture of Rome, and especially Roman law. It became the basis of civil and canon or church law. And within Roman law, it was very common that if you wanted to put an idea or a movement that threatened the stability of the empire to an end, you would use techniques to find it and either change the mindset of the people who were promoting it or simply stamp it out. Even very early in Christianity, we see that when heresies would appear, heretics would always be dealt with. They would be approached by the community and asked to repent of their wrong teaching. If they refused to do so, usually the punishment was to excommunicate them, remove them from the community, perhaps place a fine or a penance upon them, perhaps put them into exile or something along those lines. And in the extreme case, not in the early Christian world, but certainly in the Roman world, you could be put to death for certain ideas and certain practices. When we look at the Inquisition, you have to also understand that you have the church and the state working hand in hand, and each of them had a specific role. The church's role was to conduct the trials, to investigate, to see if somebody was indeed guilty of some crime. The secular authority was determined how would the punishment be carried out. The church itself didn't put people to death. It was up to the secular authority to decide if they would or so. But in this world, the church and state are so intermingled, sometimes the lines would get blurred. Where the Inquisition movement really begins to take place is first and foremost in France, towards the 12th to 13th century, and it all revolved around a movement that was taking place in southern France in a place called Elbe, a group of people called the Cathari, which are known as the Pure Ones. The Cathari movement was actually a resurrection of a very, very ancient heresy from the ancient world. It believed that essentially the world was divided up between two powers, a good God and a bad God. always in conflict. The good God was the world of the spirit, and the bad God was the world of creation, material, the body. And the idea was to strip away creation so that you could rise up to the spirit. And to do this, if you wanted to become a Cathar, you would kind of first of all undergo kind of like a baptismal rite-like ceremony. And after that, you would be ordained as someone known as a perfect. Now, a lot of people weren't able to become a perfect because it demanded a lot of you. You had to abstain from all sexual relations, you had to never eat meat, you had to participate in rigorous fasting, and perhaps even give your life. So most people weren't able to become a perfect. They would either wait till the very end of life to become one, or they would somehow participate in the community in a lesser way. But some of the really big beliefs that the Cathar had: one, they hated organized religion. They hated all civil and church authorities and rejected them. They hated the material world especially. They saw things like marriage as evil. They saw procreation and any sexual pleasure as evil. They saw the humanity of Jesus Christ to be evil and denied it. They denied all the sacraments. They especially hated the Eucharist, this idea that the Spirit, that God would become flesh. They rejected the ideas of purgatory, of resurrection of the dead. They saw motherhood as a horrible thing, and the Pope and the bishops and the clergy as the great agents of the evil God. So it was a movement that posed a serious threat to Christendom, and it was making big inroads and becoming very, very popular, and so they decided how to put an end to it. The first movement was to ask the Dominican friars who had newly been formed to recatechize and preach to the people. The goal was not so much to destroy these people, but hopefully to bring them back to salvation through catecheses, through sermons, through showing them the good conduct of living a Christian life. We know that towards the end of the movement, it became very hostile, and so eventually the King of France launched a crusade against them, and there was definitely a number of burnings where people were burnt at the stake if they refused to repent of their beliefs or if they had relapsed into heresy after coming back into the church. The real belief, though, was the idea that they had to put this to an end, and they saw this as the most effective way. Now, by and large, the Cathar actually came back to the church simply through the catecheses of the Dominicans. And probably the most tragic thing about the Cathars was the number one way they actually died was a practice that they had called endura. Endura was a quasi-compulsory forced starvation that you would have to participate in if you wouldn't go and fight against the Crusaders or if you just wanted to escape this life. Very much a form of passive euthanasia to accelerate your way out of this world. That actually killed most of the Cathars, this practice of endura, just one of the many barbaric practices that they had. After the whole Cathar experience, the Pope begins to shape the Inquisition a little bit more. And Pope Gregory IX asked for the Dominicans and the Franciscans to help him, as they were the best preachers against heresy in those days. The goal: enter into an area where they believed a lot of heresy to be present, preach, catechize, bring the people back into the faith, if need be, imposing penalties and fines. Typically what would happen is they would come to town and preach a sermon in which they would present a list of different heretical ideas that were known to be present in the town, and then you had a period in which you could go before the inquisitor, admit your guilt, and then be given your penance. Such things as pilgrimages, fines, perhaps some kind of corporal punishment. By and large, what you see is this preaching method is effective, and more often than not, people's encounter with the Inquisition will be to walk away with some kind of penalty. For example, if the great Dominican Bernard Guy was one of the great inquisitors, he charged about 930 people. The vast majority were given pilgrimage as a penance. Others were held in prison. Others were given different kind of penalties. 140 of them were acquitted, and 42 were executed. So the vast majority of people are not burnt at the stake, but given some kind of penance in return. Thomas Aquinas in his writings, wrote a little bit on the Inquisition, and what he said was, first and foremost, the church needs to see this as a call to mercy. That the heart of the Inquisition was to seek out someone, to bring them to conversion, to rehabilitate them back to the faith. He always said judgment should never be passed unless somebody has been given a fair trial, proper investigation into their crimes, and it was only when someone was completely obstinate and refused to admit any wrongdoing, refused to return back to the church, that you basically gave up on salvation for this person. And out of concern that their ideas would spread and cause others to fall away, often they would be handed over then to the secular authority who would decide what to do with them, very often execution. The main way was through burning. That was seen as the proper way to deal with a heretic in those days. As it's beginning to shape, probably the greatest mistake that the papacy makes was it begins to lose control of the Inquisitions. And what we see is that in places like Spain and France and England, different nations in the 1300s are rising up, and they want to protect their natural interests. And the Inquisition becomes a very effective tool in doing so, not only to deal with the question of heresy, but also a way to control your people. And this is where we see a lot of the great abuses of the Inquisition begin to take place. There was a Roman Inquisition that took place in papal lands. It wasn't very active, only because heresy was never a huge problem in the area that the Pope controlled, his lands. When Protestantism began, there was often trials. There would often be trials against people accused of witchcraft. Often people, especially clergy, for immoral behavior could be tried by the Inquisition. The great Galileo trial was an inquisitional trial. Galileo was not executed. People think he was, but he actually died very happily in house arrest. Even today, the Inquisition, or its child, still does exist. It's known as the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith. Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger was the head of it for many years. Now, presently, Gerhard Müller is the CDF. Its role now is to very much assure the orthodoxy of the faith, so especially if priests or religious teach any heretical ideals, they can be punished by the CDF. Typically, the most harsh crime is to be excommunicated. What that basically means is if you're excommunicated, you've basically been removed from the church, and the idea you can't receive the sacraments. If you're a priest, you couldn't exercise your ministry. You're always able to come back to confess your wrongdoing, repent, and be brought back into the church. So that's how, if you will, the Inquisition operates today in the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith. I promise you they don't burn people anymore. But when we talk about the Inquisition, the one that's always going to jump out into our minds is Spain, because Spain is where the most inquisitional activity takes place. It's the one that has the most infamy behind it. And Spain is this very interesting example in European history. It's kind of the fortress ecclesia. It's the one place in Europe where it remained essentially 100% Catholic. And there was this amazing zeal in the Spanish people to preserve the purity of their faith. And Spain's also a tragic example of, they belonged to the universal church, but the church began to collapse in on itself, that really its focus just became Spain, both its religious and its political interests. It's also the great example of what happens when the Inquisition is taken out of papal control and given over almost entirely to the hands of the Spanish kings and queens, and what they will do to wield the Inquisition to their own ends. To understand Spain, well, you have to break it up into a few time periods. The Inquisition probably appears in the year about 1170, and it rises to its power in the 1400s in Spain. And Spain is this very interesting country in that it has three populations: a Christian population, a Jewish population, and a Muslim population. And during the 1100s, the country is basically mostly ruled by the Muslims, with pockets of Christianity and Judaism in it. And what you actually find is, as you get more into the history, is there actually is a lot of civil and friendly relationships between the three peoples. For example, King Alphonsus X actually boasted that he was the king of three great religions. And what you'd find in your typical Spanish town in the countryside or even in a big city, you'd find the people living side by side. Especially among the Jewish people, lots of opportunities. They were farmers, they were herders, craftsmen, shopkeepers. In the city of Toledo, the Jews were renowned for taking the philosophical works of the East in Arabic and Hebrew and translating them into Latin. They were renowned especially as physicians. They were courtiers of the kings, and they also had the unfortunate privilege, I guess we can say, to become the tax collectors, the usurers, and the financiers of the kings and queens, which made them very resented because they would be the ones who would collect taxes on their behalf. It should be noticed that actually in many ways there was a lot of mutual belief and even understanding among them. I remember reading one Inquisition trial that I found very interesting where a man was brought before the Inquisition because he declared, "It doesn't matter what you believe, Christian, Jew, Muslim, all of them go to heaven." Well, the Inquisition took note with that, but in ways there was that kind of common belief among the people, that they did have a mutual respect for each other. A mutual respect, but at the same time, also hostilities. And even though they lived in the same country, in many ways they also lived very different existences, obviously in the religious sphere. And so you have this interesting mix of three cultures into one, times of hostility and times of peace. Later into the 1400s, what's happening is Christians are slowly taking more and more and more and more back of the country. And as they do so, a lot of legislation was made that made life for Jewish people and Muslim people very difficult. Although what you find is often the legislation wasn't always followed. So even in something like a major city where there was a mandatory ghetto for the Jewish people to live, many of them opted not to and were undisturbed. Although most Jewish people preferred the protection of the ghetto, it also allowed you to lead a kosher Jewish lifestyle much easier in the confines of a ghetto than if you were detached from a synagogue community. This isn't to say the persecutions weren't present. The first great persecution in Spain took place in 1391. There was riots in the major cities of Spain against wealthy Christians, but in particular against wealthy Jews, and many of them were murdered. Many of the ghettos were attacked. And this is the first instance where you have large numbers of Jewish people converting over and becoming Christians. Despite all the horrors of the riots, similar persecutions often did break out, but there was also times of peace. And it's notable that a lot of church and government authorities were always quick to protect a lot of the Jewish people. The other time where a lot of hostility towards the Jews took place was when the Black Plague spread across Europe. And many rumors began to spread that the Jews were doing it. They were poisoning the wells. Something within them was causing everyone to get sick. Very interestingly, in the 1300s, Pope Clement VI actually came to their defense and wrote a whole bull saying this is absolutely ridiculous. The Jewish people are not causing the plague. Stop persecuting them. They were, as I said, resented because even during the time of the plague, they would collect taxes from those who were dying on the orders of the kings. There was also an awareness among Christian scholars as they began to read a lot of the Jewish books, especially a book known as the Talmud, which is a commentary on the Jewish life. There's some passages in it, not a whole lot, but some of them that are very, very anti-Christian. And so sometimes they would be used to attack Jewish people. And then there was also a rumor that spread around Europe known as the blood libel. They believed that sometimes Jewish people would go and kidnap Christian children, kill them, and then use their blood to make the Passover bread. Once again, the popes frequently came to their defense. For example, Pope Innocent IV denied the charge of the blood libel. And even as recent as the early 1900s in Poland, Pope Benedict XV wrote a letter to the Polish bishops reprimanding the people for accusing the Jewish people of the blood libel, and none other than Pius XII, while he was the young Eugenio Pacelli, was one of the ones who helped to draft, but that talk will be in a couple weeks' time. Despite the fact that the church was formally defending the Jews, a lot of pogroms, a lot of attacks on the ghettos was still taking place, and persecution against them was beginning to mount. And what you find is specifically in Spain, as again, they are taking back more and more land, the Christians, now they become more hostile towards the Muslims. And you'll see it in Spanish churches. If you go in, there's a statue of St. James the Moor Slayer. So we'll have St. James on a horse, usually trampling Muslims beneath his feet. It was becoming very dangerous for Jewish people and Muslim people in Spain. And as I said, even though a lot of oppressive laws and sanctions were offered by the Christian people, often they weren't enforced on a local or even national level. But in the years 1450 to 1490, the Inquisition really begins to gain in power, and it's beginning to address one big question. The question is this: a lot of Jewish people are becoming Catholic, but what they discover is that in secret they are actually still practicing and believing the Jewish way of life. They have to address this. They have to see, was their conversion really authentic, or was it simply done to obtain a better status in society, because they were often denied a lot of privileges while they were still Jews and Muslims. At this time, too, Christians could be charged by the Inquisition. You could be charged if you were involved in local folk magic or witchcraft, especially the clergy. If you behaved in a scandalous manner, you could be charged. These were not executionable offenses, but you could be given different penances for such behaviors. The other very important development is in Spain, two monarchs are married, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. And when the two crowns come together, Spain is a unified force. They themselves are very interesting figures. A lot of people accuse them of being very anti-Semitic, but on a personal level, it doesn't seem that they were. I mean, they both had Jewish doctors, they had Jews among their courtiers, and we know that they enacted a lot of legislation to actually protect Jewish civil rights and businesses. But what we do see in Ferdinand and Isabella is a desire to have the Inquisition belong to them, and especially to move any papal intervention from what's going to happen in Spain, because the papacy is becoming very, very critical of what's going on in Spain. I'd like to read you a quote from Pope Sixtus IV in the late 1400s over what he thought about what was going on in Spain at the time. He said, "The Inquisition has for some time not been moved by zeal for the faith or the salvation of souls, but by a lust for wealth. And many true and faithful Christians, on testimony of their enemies, have without any legitimate proof been thrust into secular prisons, tortured and condemned as relapsed heretics, deprived of their goods and property, and handed over to the secular arm to be executed, to the peril of souls, setting a pernicious example and causing disgust to many, for even the heretic is entitled to a fair and simple trial." Strong words from the Pope. Unfortunately, they didn't have much effect. What you see is slowly but surely Spain begins to take control of the Inquisition, and the papacy will never be able to win it back. There will be a continual conflict between Rome and Spain over the trials. For example, during a trial, if someone wanted to appeal to Rome their decision, the Inquisition would catch it before it could move forward, and it would never make it. Or if one did make it to Rome and a reply was sent, again, intercepted by the Inquisition, so that they were unable to intervene. Sadly, the papacy surrendered supreme jurisdiction over to the Spanish. In the 1700s, it was forbidden any contact with Rome, so the papacy is not going to have very much of a role from this time on, what is going to be unleashed in Spain after the year 1492. 1492 may ring for you in your mind. That's the year Christopher Columbus sails to the New World. It was also the year that after 800 years, the Christians take back Spain. And under Ferdinand and Isabella, they now completely control the country, having driven the Muslims out of the last stronghold of the city of Granada in the south. The response that's most known to the people is this: they order that all of the Jews leave Spain. And we are talking about 800,000 people in 1492. Should also be appreciated, this was a difficult decision for the king and queen because they were losing, obviously, a lot of taxpayers. They were losing a lot of skilled workers, courtiers, physicians, different talented people. But there is this zeal in the Spanish to have a purely Catholic country. And namely, they're very concerned that Jewish converts to Catholicism are interacting too much with those who remain Jewish, and it's causing them to relapse back into a Jewish way of life, causing them to fall into heresy. This was the belief: better to remove the Jews from the country to protect those who had converted than to have them remain. Now, in reality, this doesn't happen. You're basically given a choice: leave or become Catholic. But a lot of Jewish people simply didn't convert and remained in the country, and by and large were actually left alone. Especially in small countryside, it was very easy to continue your life as a farmer, as a herder, etc. More difficult in the city, though. What happens is a lot of Jews do leave Spain. Very generously, the wealthy ones help the poorer ones to leave. Those who could not afford it would often opt to be baptized and become Catholic. They wanted often to continue their careers, to continue their way of life here in Spain, and so they would often wholeheartedly become Catholic, or they would convert but practice Judaism in secret. Very interestingly, if you ever watched the Borgia movie, you probably know Alexander VI, the scandalous pope who had a mistress and lots of children like that. He probably welcomed the most Jews out of any kind of leader into Rome, and lots of them moved to Rome, to the great Jewish ghetto in Trastevere in the city. So despite his lack of moral compass, he was actually very generous in allowing the Jews to escape Spain. Many of them go to North Africa. Many of them dream to go to the Holy Land. And across Europe, people were shocked by what happened. For example, the Sultan in Turkey was absolutely amazed that Ferdinand and Isabella would let so many talented, wealthy people leave the country, so many taxpayer dollars. They didn't understand the mindset of the Spanish zeal. What you see in the Inquisition is now it's going to be focused primarily on this question of, for those Jews who became Catholic, had they truly mind, heart, body, and soul converted? Were they really leading a Catholic life? Did they really believe it? Because this is the important thing about the Inquisition. If you are not Catholic, the Inquisition cannot touch you. But the moment you become Catholic, you fall under church law, canon law, and you can be tried for different crimes. So they want to seek out to see, are people still practicing the Jewish way of life in secret, or have they truly become Catholic? Sadly, what it begins to appear, though, is that as the trials begin to take place, you discover that the people's motivation for bringing people forward is usually not because they're actually concerned about this person's eternal salvation. They're often looking for a way to ruin someone, a financial competitor, maybe an adulterous spouse, somebody you don't like. If you knew they were a convert, this was a good way to get at them. And Spanish society will very much be divided into two types of Catholic: the New Catholic and the Old Catholic. The New Catholic being the recent convert to the faith, the Old Catholic being the families that have remained Catholic for many generations. And among the Old Catholics, there was a great dislike for the New Catholics because they were now rising up as financial competitors, having a better quality of life, more opportunities to open for them. And so this was a great way to get back at those who were trying to take away from you. And you have to understand that the new converts made up all segments of society: the poor, the rich. Among the clergy, a lot of the priests, even the bishops, were the new converts. Interestingly enough, even the great Grand Inquisitor Tomas Torquemada, his uncle, was a recent convert. There's belief that perhaps Teresa of Avila, in her bloodline, was from a convert family. So they became a very easy target of accusation if you wanted to ruin them. Throughout Spain, their bishops would rebuke the Old Catholics for their attitude, but by and large, it didn't have much effect. And so you always have to keep that in mind when we're talking about the trials, that often people were not guilty of the crimes they were accused of. Often they were simply accused of them in order to get back at somebody you really disliked. And then later, in the 1500s, most Jewish converts have been dealt with, and the question will be Protestantism. Protestantism, though, is almost completely unable to make any inroads in Spain, so there wasn't a whole lot of trials around them. There was a lot of censoring of books, material that would try to get into the country to influence them with Protestant ideas, but by and large, they're not able to make much of an impression. Also, should be appreciated that old Spanish Catholics could also be tried by the Inquisition for a whole variety of different immoral behaviors or superstitious practices. And as I said, even the great Teresa of Avila at one point has to go before the Inquisition for her own writings. Later in history, the focus will be more on Muslims who become Catholic to see the authenticity of their conversion. But then we see by the time the 1700s roll around, The Inquisition is already beginning to lose a lot of its power, a lot of its influence, and largely ignored by Spanish society. And then after Napoleon conquers the Spanish in the early 1800s, by the year 1834, the Inquisition is done, left bankrupt, and having no longer the effect of causing fear in the hearts of the Spanish people. How did it run? How would a typical trial take place? Well, you would have local tribunals set up all over the country, usually where a large amount of Jewish people had converted to Catholicism. Each tribunal had the same set of procedures, a manual that you would have to follow very scrupulously. You'd be punished if you deviated from the norm. Each tribunal would have 2 inquisitors. One was a canon law expert, one was a theologian. You would have a legal advisor for the accused. You would have a constable to watch over the proceedings. You would have a prosecutor on behalf of the Inquisition. And you'd have a number of assistants known as the familiars. The familiars were members of the laity who either financially or through their time and work supported the Inquisition. The familiars were the real troublemakers of the Inquisition because they were the ones who could be bought and sold. If you wanted to accuse someone, you could buy the favor of the familiar and they would bring accusations against the accused to try to ruin them. So they were very hard to control because they could be bought off, whereas clergy, in theory, were barred from taking any financial gain for their work in the Inquisition. It should also be noted that it was not a successful financial enterprise. Sometimes the accusation is made the Inquisition was set up to make money. In fact, they were frequently struggling to even operate. They made very little from the fines they would put on people. Even if they confiscated property, they'd have to return it if somebody was set free, not a way to make much cash. The reason it was so hard to run was because it had a huge bureaucracy and employed so many people that very rarely was it able to obtain much wealth. They didn't own any property, which was the way you made wealth in those days. So by and large, they always struggled to operate this massive machine that was set up all across Spain. A typical trial, as I said, we know from the thing that's amazing about the Spanish Inquisition is we have unbelievable documentation, meticulous documentation of what took place. And we know that every place followed the same manual, the same procedures, the same sequence of events. What would happen is the local clergy would be informed the Inquisition was going to come to your town to cause fear in the hearts of the people. And then eventually the Inquisition would come there. Often they were very reluctant to do so because they knew how much it was going to cost them to run this Inquisition, but so they went. And after the clergy had said the Inquisition is coming, you were free to approach them, to confess any guilt, and be given a light penance before the Inquisition would show up. When it did, everyone would be asked to go to the church, a mass would be celebrated, a sermon would be preached, and a list of accusations would be read. And you were given 30 to 40 days, a grace period to come before the Inquisition and admit wrongdoing. And if you did so, you wouldn't go to trial, you would pay your fine, do your pilgrimage, do your penance, and you would be set free. This edict of grace really did allow you to come forward and for you personally to admit guilt. Because the other thing the Inquisition was very good about was asking the community band together and reveal to us, are there hidden heretics in your midst? And again, this is where the abuses begin to take place, because you find people's motivation is often not about saving other souls, but to ruin them. I will read you some of the more ridiculous accusations that were often made, cases that were dismissed. For example, one woman was brought before the Inquisition to say she was a heretic because she smiled at the name of Mary. An elderly gentleman was brought before because he'd been eating bacon on a day of abstinence. A man was found urinating outside of a church, and so seen as a blasphemer. My favorite, in the midst of a card game, a man said that God helped him to make his friends lose, and so brought before the inquisitors. Lighthearted accusations, but real accusations that were brought and obviously dismissed. The major task of the inquisitor, he had to separate truth from fiction. So all the testimonies, all the denunciations were collected, archived, and looked at by the inquisitors, and they would investigate what was the crime, if there was any. Now, the one that would come out very clearly was any heresy present. And if it was, you would be arrested, and you would be put in an Inquisition jail. Your property would be seized, and money would be used to support your family and also to pay for your stay in prison. It should be noted that actually the Inquisitional jails were much nicer than the local town jail. We have from records a much higher standard of hygiene. Even in some would be able to serve decent meals, a glass of wine, and there was even often a chapel to pray. It's prison nonetheless, don't get me wrong, but compared to the overcrowded town jails, the Inquisitional jails were actually not as harsh. In fact, we know in the year 1629 that one friar admitted to heresy because he wanted to be moved from the town jail to the Inquisitional one. And we also know that often the poor, if the poor were accused of heresy, they obviously couldn't pay, so the Inquisition paid for your time in prison. And it's not surprising the number of them actually did want to be there because you could actually be fed and have a place to stay, as horrible as prison is. Now, if you were charged with heresy, more often than not, it meant you were probably guilty of something. And the rest of the trial has to be understood as penitential as opposed to juridical. The idea is the inquisitors would constantly ask the person, examine yourself. Have you done anything wrong? Do you have anything confess? And if you did so, you would be able to receive a much lighter sentence than the death penalty. The death penalty was only given if you stubbornly refused to admit any guilt, or if you had been set free and then you had fallen back into heresy once again, you'd be tried as a relapsed heretic, and you wouldn't be given a retrial, although later in Inquisitional history you could be. Once again, the church wouldn't execute you, you would be handed over to the secular power to be dealt with. A big question that obviously and should cause a lot of discomfort, disgust in people was the fact that they did use torture in order to exact confessions. This was not something particular to the Inquisition. This was very common across Europe in the time. Once again, they picked it up from ancient Roman law. In ancient Roman law, the application of torture was seen as a way to extract information from someone if you could tell they were lying, if you could tell they were refusing to reveal any information. Within the Inquisition, there were guidelines of how it should be done. It doesn't mean it always was. But the idea was not so much to inflict pain for pain's sake or as punishment, but to extract information, to try to rehabilitate a person strangely through punishment. Some of the, how would kind of torture be used in a trial? Well, if in the midst of a trial it was seen that you had had the opportunity to defend yourself, but they thought you were lying, they thought you were holding something back, then they could use the torture to get the information. More often than not, though, they actually didn't have to use it. They had this practice, in Latin it's called conspectu tormentorum, where they would bring you into the room and show you all the instruments, and usually that was enough to cause fear to enter in your heart, and you would admit any guilt if there was any. It should also be noted that its use was very infrequent. We know this because we have so much detailed documentation of how it was being used. I'll give you an example of that, or I should say before that, if you did confess under torture, it would be stopped. They wouldn't just prolong it for the sake of prolonging it. And then once you were feeling better, then they would ask you again, okay, you admitted to this, is this in fact true? Now, more often than not, somebody would say, yes, that was true, because they don't want to be tortured again. Again, technically you weren't supposed to torture someone again, but almost rarely did it ever happen again, because it was a traumatic experience. But as I said, it wasn't used that frequently. I'll give you some real numbers. For example, the Inquisitions in the town of Real Ciudad between the years 1483 and 1485, of 400 trials, only 2 were ever tortured. In Granada, between the years 1573 and 1577, 18 of 256 experienced torture, or 7% of the prisoners. By the 1800s, was completely and totally forbidden. The Pope actually had some say and could get something through to the Spanish. And you could only ever be tortured in the case of heresy. Any other crime you could not be. It was never carried out by priests, never carried out by monks, always carried out by a professional executioner. A doctor was present on hand, and there would be somebody on behalf of the bishop to monitor. The basic rule was you couldn't break bone, you couldn't cause someone to bleed, you couldn't mutilate the body, and you couldn't cause death, although it could happen. And there was 3 ways that it was done. They had what was known as a pulley. They basically hold your arms behind your back and then lift you up into the air. They would often lay you on a table, put a rag in your mouth and pour water down your throat, or the rack, where they would strap you and then begin to pull the body. Brutal, and they shouldn't be justified. They were very, very brutal, very, very effective. Though I'll show you later on that compared to some other places in Europe, they were in fact milder forms of torture. They were taking place in other places on the continent. As you came to the end of the trial, there was 3 outcomes that could happen. Number 1, you could be acquitted, found innocent of all wrongdoing and set free, or maybe they would suspend your trial and have to retry you at a certain point, which you certainly didn't want to happen. You could be given penance, or you could be reconciled. If you were given penance, it was a lesser punishment. You would go on pilgrimage, you would pay a fine. They also had this practice where people would wear something called a San Benito. It was this garment that would go along the back and the front, and you would wear something that looked like a dunce cap. And on the front of the pictures would be pictures of devils or different things, and you would have to wear it as a way of shame, showing that you had done wrongdoing, and people wouldn't think very well of you. In fact, at certain points, you'd have to hang it up in the church building. A more severe would be to be reconciled to the church. Those punishments could be quite harsh. You could be exiled, you could be publicly flogged, you could be put in prison, house arrest, or you could work a stint on a galley ship in rowing the ship. The final, most severe punishment was to be burnt at the stake or to be burnt in effigy, where they would make a scarecrow of you and burn that, usually because you had somehow escaped and gotten away before the trial. They would nonetheless bring you to trial and set the scarecrow on fire. The vast majority, we know from the records, were reconciled to the faith. That was the common punishment. Penance or reconciliation was the most known outcome. It should also be known that a vast majority of the people never went through trial. They were simply excused or given a light penance in order to do, and so never spent any time in prison or in trial. And it should also be noted that it's very interesting in some recent Inquisition studies, they actually took insanity as a plea into case that could absolve you of any wrongdoing. If a crime had been done when you were drunk under duress, you could also be forgiven. They weren't adverse to circumstances standing in the way of you doing something without total freedom. And also a misconception, you wouldn't be tried too if they detected demonic possession. That was not you couldn't be punished if that would happen, and that would never be held against you in an Inquisition trial. As I said, this wasn't particularly unique, this idea of an Inquisition among Catholics. Not here to pick on our Protestant friends, but Martin Luther was a big advocate of inquisitional activity. He, in fact, encouraged German princes to go out to put especially Anabaptists under trial. John Calvin in Geneva had his own Inquisition of sorts, burnt many of his own heretics in Geneva. Queen Elizabeth I is quite renowned for her persecution, execution of Jesuits, of different Catholic priests in England on the charge of heresy. Common across Europe, whether you were Catholic, whether you were Protestant, death by fire was the way to deal with a heretic. It should also be noted the difference between an Inquisition and a secular trial was, in an Inquisition trial, they are really trying to bring you back into the faith and get you to confess wrongdoing, where often in a secular trial, much more the thrust is punishment for punishment's sake to put an end to the threat against the state. And so they had very different procedures of how it was carried out. Another notable feature in Spain, they had something called the auto de fe. It was a public Inquisition ceremony, and people from all over would come to watch them. They were the way for the kings and queens of Spain to showcase their power and the orthodoxy of Spanish Catholicism. It was about bringing the people together. It was almost a big party, and it was a way to show how people were being reconciled back into the church. In fact, we'll find often it was believed that the showcase of the auto de fe was the burnings. More often than not, that was not the case. They were very, very popular, and people would come to see them. In fact, they would have bullfights and they would have fireworks. It was a great festival for the people. It would begin the night before with a procession into the grounds, and then in the morning they would have mass, a sermon would be preached, everyone would receive breakfast, even those who were going to be executed if they were, and then publicly people would be given their penances and reconciled back to the church, and there would be great excitement as they watched friends and family be reconciled once again with the church. Sometimes there were public executions, but often they believed that more often than not they were done outside of the city walls because of the gruesome spectacle that they were, but often at an auto de fe you would watch a public execution. They were rare simply because they were extremely expensive, but when they were done, they were very effective for the kings and queen to consolidate their power. Another question that burns in people's mind, but how many people did they actually put to death? How many people died, were executed by the Inquisition? This is one of these things where we actually have a very, very accurate number because they took very meticulous records. You have to understand the Spanish Inquisition was not trying to hide or cover up what it was doing. It was very much transparent in showing because they were very proud of their work. And the archives, the majority of them are all still in Madrid, so people have been able to look at the records to see, if you will, what the death toll was. What we find, actually the numbers are quite small. I'll give you some real numbers here. In the city of Valencia, in the years 1566 to 1609, 3,075 people were tried by the Inquisition. 44% were given a penance, 40% were reconciled, only 3% were absolved of any wrongdoing, 9% had their trial suspended, 2% had an effigy of them burnt, and 2% were burnt at the stake. There's an interesting book in the fundamentalist evangelical world called The Mystery of Babylon Revealed. And in it, it says that 95 million were killed by the Spanish Inquisition, which is remarkable as the population of Europe was nowhere near that number. Actual evidence will show somewhere in the region of 3,000 to 5,000. And of those 3,000 to 5,000, it's also hard to determine were they burnt alive or was it an effigy of them, because they didn't mark a difference. More often than not, they simply said executed. Most of them took place in the years 1480 to 1492, which was the Inquisition was still rather young, and that was the most ferocious period where it was being employed. There's very much a black legend that revolves around the Inquisition, a lot of the misconceptions around it. How this legend began was when Spanish or continental Protestants were beginning to escape from Spain. More often than not, an Englishman, a Dutchman, a German somehow found himself in Spain, perhaps underwent some kind of persecution by the Inquisition, escaped, and throughout Europe, all of a sudden, stories began to spread about what's going on in Spain. Most people didn't know, because Spain had very much closed itself off from the rest of Europe. But especially in Protestant countries, because they were so effective in their use of the printing press, it became the major source of propaganda against the Catholic Church. The reformers painted these horror stories of what was going on in Spain. But what's very interesting is they didn't talk about the fact that it were Jewish converts being persecuted. They made it out to seem that it was an attack on Protestantism, and that if Spain somehow grew in power, Spain would unleash the Inquisition on the rest of the Protestant world. I think Protestants discovered, I'm not trying to speak critically en masse of them, but of the mindset of the time, they discovered the power of the martyr. If you want to promote your cause, have a martyr to promote it. And so the Inquisition became the great one to say, this will produce a multitude of martyrs, it will kill our children, this is the agent of the Antichrist, it must be stopped, it must be slandered. And you can see that if you read kind of some of the typical Protestant histories of the time. When they describe the Inquisition, they embellish it in a way that the Inquisition never was. There's one by a gentleman named John Motley, wrote a history of the Dutch Republic back in the 1800s. He describes such things as the inquisitors stripping people nude to torture them. He talked of them taking fire to burn their heels. He talked of tables of knives that would stab and prod you. He talked of a doll that you would embrace and then blades would go into you. And he talked of monks laughing hysterically as they carried out these tortures. Well, these things aren't real, but they became very real in the mind of the Protestant world. That being said, a lot of the Catholic world was not very impressed with what was going on in Spain. The Papal States, Italian city-states, Catholic Netherlands found what was happening in Spain to be very repulsive. And we also see in this time period that there's also almost a parallel Inquisition movement happening in the Protestant world. People are often surprised to hear that in no country were more people burnt alive as a heretic than Presbyterian Scotland. The witch hunts of Presbyterian Scotland claimed more victims than any Inquisition along the Catholic world. A great zeal to eradicate what they thought to be demonic possession in witches and warlocks and different things in Scotland. That was the terror unleashed on that country really hasn't been totally understood yet. It was a very common idea that this is how you dealt with this problem. Especially when you look at England, you find another example of where in a Protestant world where it became very horrible what happened in terms of torture. They have a long list of the different tortures that could be endured in the Tower of London. They know there was a large pit in which people would be placed. They know that there was something called the scavenger's daughter, where you'd be folded up into a little ball with an iron ring. They devised cells that would crouch you into a small bowl until you would be crushed. Especially Elizabeth in England was known for its disemboweling and quartering and juring of both Puritan and Catholic. Again, this isn't meant to be an attack, simply to show that in the medieval world, there was a lot of this kind of activity taking place. And so it can't be put squarely on the feet of the Spanish or the Catholic Inquisitions, but a real problem in the ethos of Europe in general, how it dealt with people whose beliefs differed from their own. As you move into the Enlightenment period, you begin to have your first histories, world histories being written. And what you find is because they're largely based on Protestant sources, there's not a very objective study of the Inquisition taking place. The other thing you find is if you've ever read Gothic romantic novels, the Gothic writers loved the Inquisition as being the perfect setting for their very mysterious, macabre, and sinister stories. And they were especially infatuated with the torture of especially the Virgin by the Spanish Inquisition. Gothic romantic novels very much were the first pornographic novels ever written, and they really can't be looked upon as a very critical source of what the Inquisition was all about. If you're an art history fan, you may be familiar with the work of Goya. Goya was a tremendous Spanish artist, not particularly in love with the church, but a lot of his artwork too would really frame the mind of how we would perceive the Inquisition today. And it was really only after Napoleon took over Spain that historians for the first time in history had access to the actual archives and began to write histories, good histories, about the Inquisition, because finally they had records of what was actually taking place. The first one was written by a gentleman named Juan Antonio Lorente in the year 1817. He had access to a tremendous amount of documents. They gave him a lot of understanding. Followed by that, an American by the name of Henry Charles Lea also began to write a great Inquisition history. And I'd say really in the last 30 years has the best sources been done. Henry Kamen and Peter Edwards are the two best if you want to read more on it. Why their histories are so good is they began to just understand a little bit what the people actually believed, what they were actually trying to understand, what were their motivations, what was the role of the Inquisitor, how did they go about their methods. A very meticulous study of this project. As a way to conclude, I'd like to leave you with a quote by the great philosopher Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard had this to say. He said, "What is true is what I recognize as being true." That kind of fits into the world that we live in. We're a world that, for good and for bad, we believe in, we see the value in other religions, we believe in tolerance, freedom of expression. Sometimes we relativize truth too much, but we live in a much more open-minded world. For the medieval world, what is true is what the church recognized to be true. And anything that somehow undermined that was just simply seen as unacceptable to the world at large. So maybe somewhere in the middle between the modern mindset and the medieval mindset, we'll try to unpack a little bit what happened in Spain, and from that, hopefully just have a little bit better understanding of what took place in those days.